Breaking tonight, Canada has just challenged American economic dominance, and Australia said, "We're in." Alliances are being redrawn across the Pacific. Mark Carney proposed that middle powers unite against economic coercion. Instead of responding with diplomatic caution, Canberra committed to action. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that Mark Carney will address the Australian Parliament in March. For years, everyone assumed Davos speeches were performative theatre. Political analysts expected polite diplomatic niceties without substance. Markets assumed Canada's middle power thesis would fade within weeks. They were all utterly wrong. Sydney, January 25. Standing before Australian Broadcasting Corporation cameras, Prime Minister Albanese made a statement that electrified Ottawa. "My friend Mark Carney will visit Australia with an address to the Parliament in March." Then came the line that revealed everything about what is actually happening: "I agree with him." Translation: Australia just told the world that Canada's vision of middle powers acting together is no longer theoretical. It's operational. And what happened next matters even more. The country that shares Canada's deepest concerns about American economic weaponization revealed exactly why Carney's Davos speech is becoming the blueprint for a new global architecture. Dear viewers, between Davos and now, something extraordinary has happened in middle power relationships. Trump threatened allies with tariffs. Carney said enough. And Australia, along with strategically Pacific-facing partners, became the first nation to publicly commit to turning Canada's thesis into action. This isn't about one parliamentary visit. This is about the fundamental restructuring of global alliances and the collapse of great power dominance as the only framework for international cooperation. The context at Davos: Carney delivered a speech that financial media initially dismissed as standard Canadian multilateralism. He called on middle powers to accept the end of the rules-based global order and act together to avoid victimization by American hegemony. It sounded like familiar diplomatic language. That interpretation was absolutely wrong. What Carney actually articulated was a declaration of independence from great power patronage systems. He positioned Canada not as America's junior partner seeking protection, but as a middle power with agency, resources, and strategic options. He named the reality others only whispered about: economic integration has become a weapon, and tariffs have become leverage. Trump's response was immediate criticism, because Trump recognized exactly what the speech represented: a direct challenge to American economic dominance over allied nations. But here's what truly mattered. While Trump criticized, middle power leaders listened. Anthony Albanese publicly agreed. Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico expressed appreciation. The speech struck a chord not because of elegant phrasing, but because it articulated what middle power leaders were already thinking. From theory to practice, Albanese didn't just praise Carney's speech, he invited him to address the Australian Parliament. That is not diplomatic courtesy. That is strategic alignment. Parliamentary addresses are reserved for leaders whose vision matters, whose ideas require amplification, and whose policies deserve legislative consideration. The timing is deliberate. March 2026 places Carney's visit just months after Davos, maintaining momentum as Trump's tariff threats continue to escalate. The broader context matters just as much. In October, Canada and Australia signed an agreement deepening cooperation on critical minerals, the exact sector where both nations face American pressure and Chinese competition. Connect the dots: critical minerals agreement in October, Davos speech in January, parliamentary address in March. That isn't coincidence. That's sequential strategy execution. Australia faces the same strategic pressures as Canada: geographic distance from the United States, trade dependence on volatile partners, exposure to Chinese economic influence, and vulnerability to great power coercion. Albanese understands that Canada's middle power thesis isn't abstract theory, it's practical necessity. The emerging network: Carney positions Canada as an example of middle power agency. Australia commits to parliamentary engagement. Mexico signals alignment. These aren't isolated gestures. They're nodes in an emerging network. Traditional alliance frameworks divided the world into great powers and dependents. America leads, allies follow. China dominates, neighbors comply. Russia commands, satellites obey. That architecture assumed middle powers lacked agency, resources, or coordination capacity. Carney's thesis challenges that assumption directly. Middle powers possess significant economic capacity, technological sophistication, resource endowments, and diplomatic reach. What they've lacked isn't capability, it's coordination. Now, coordination is emerging. Canada articulates the framework. Australia commits to engagement. Mexico expresses interest. Each relationship reinforces the others. Each commitment proves feasibility. Each partnership expands strategic options. The pattern is unmistakable: middle powers with shared concerns, facing similar pressures, and holding complementary capabilities are beginning to act collectively, rather than waiting for great power direction. Toward institutional architecture, the Davos speech opened doors. The Australia visit demonstrates momentum. But sustainable realignment requires institutions. Some observers suggest formalizing coordination through an M50 organization, representing roughly 50 of the world's leading middle powers, potentially headquartered in Western Canada, equidistant for Asian, African, Oceanic, South American, Middle Eastern, and European leaders. Why would this matter? Because it would create permanent infrastructure for middle power coordination that doesn't currently exist. The G7 is dominated by great powers. The G20 includes too many competing interests. Middle powers need their own forum, one where they set agendas rather than react to great power initiatives. The practical payoff: consider the opportunities: South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, Australia, South Korea. These are large economies with shared interests in resisting economic coercion and maintaining strategic autonomy. An M50 framework could coordinate critical mineral supply chains, bypassing great power monopolies. It could establish alternative trade routes, reducing dependence on American or Chinese markets. It could foster technology partnerships beyond existing power structures. Skeptics call this unrealistic. But remember what seemed unrealistic just months ago: Canada openly challenging American economic dominance, Australia publicly aligning with Canada's strategic vision, middle power leaders treating Carney's thesis as an actionable framework. What changed wasn't capacity, it was willingness. Why this matters for Canada: Canada still sends roughly 2/3 of its exports to the United States. That dependence creates vulnerability, not just economic, but political. Diversification isn't a luxury. It's a strategic necessity. Australia doesn't replace the U.S. market, but it reduces concentration. Add Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, South Korea, and others, and suddenly American leverage diminishes. Not eliminated, reduced. That's the point. Carney's Davos speech proposed the framework. Australia's response begins implementation. Middle power coordination offers a path forward. The alternative is continuing within systems designed for great power dominance, accepting economic coercion as inevitable and hoping for benevolence history tells us rarely arrives. The test ahead: the March Australia visit is the first real test. Can shared vision become policy coordination? Can parliamentary engagement produce real cooperation? Can diplomatic alignment become economic partnership? If yes, Canada may have helped build a framework that allows middle powers to navigate great power competition without becoming its casualties. If not, we'll learn that even the most compelling speeches can't overcome the structural challenges of coordinating dozens of sovereign nations. Either way, we are watching something significant unfold. Not guaranteed. Not inevitable. But possible. The age of middle powers waiting quietly may be ending. And March will tell us whether middle power theory can finally become middle power practice. We'll be watching.